thought I'd be talking about literal socialism. But here we are. It turns out that socialism is a lot like the bad guy in a low-budget horror movie. In the sense that in cheap horror films, there's always a sequence of scenes towards the end where the baddie just refuses to die. And it's extremely annoying if you're watching it and you want the movie to be over, but he just always gets up again. No matter how many times he gets shot, stabbed, thrown out of a window, whatever. No matter how implausible, the baddie gets up again. And socialism is like that. As I said 30 years ago, fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a widespread perception that this is it. Now then, there was another socialist experiment just over a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Venezuela. For a while that was very fashionable in Western countries to idealize that form of socialism. Now that that has collapsed as well, you could be forgiven for thinking, come on, now the penny must drop. How many more times do we have to go through this? But no, quite the opposite. Just as we saw the collapse of another socialist experiment in real time, socialism has also made a massive comeback in Britain, certainly, and to a lesser extent some other Western countries. This is from The Economist from earlier this year. They dedicated an entire edition to this phenomenon, calling it the rise of millennial socialism. The New Statesman as well, of course, differences in their assessment of the phenomenon. The Economist being mostly skeptical, the New Statesman being very supportive, New York Times somewhere in between, but they all agreed on it. Millennial socialism, if you want to call it that, if you want to call it a movement, or whatever name you want to give it, it is real, it is a thing. And this isn't just a social media bubble phenomenon, this is something that's really happening. We can see this in plenty of surveys. Here's one example of that. This is a survey from last year, where the question was, communism could have worked if it had been better executed. Do you agree with this statement? And it turned out, specifically among people under the age of 35, that's pretty much the definition of millennial, about 40%, so 2 out of 5, agreed with this statement. And even among the other 60%, most didn't, or not all of them actually actively disagreed. There were a lot who just gave a non-committal answer. They said, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. And that means that among those who do have an opinion on this subject, there is a clear relative majority who agree with the statement. So this is, of course, a different way of saying it wasn't real communism. Real communism hasn't been tried. It's a cliche, to put it like that, but you can see it isn't just a cliche, it is also an actually widely held view. And here's a similar survey. Let's see. Manually. This is a similar survey where they asked, do you have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion of socialism? And again, a clear relative majority. There's always a lot who just say, I'm not sure, I don't know. But among those who do express a view on that subject, among younger age groups, there's a clear majority who do have a favorable view of socialism. And in this case, it's not just millennials in the strictest sense, this is also Generation X, and yes, it does decrease with age, but you have to go, even among people in their 50s, early 60s, it's still about equal, people with who are pro, people who are anti. You have to go much higher up the age distribution until you have a clear relative, a clear net disapproval of socialism. So millennial socialism is a real thing, and it goes beyond just the millennial generation. Now these are surveys about abstract concepts, but if you ask more specific questions, such as about industry nationalizations, price controls, state-directed investment, the Green New Deal would be an example, you see pretty much the same result. So it isn't just the label socialism that's popular, it is actual socialist policies. Now these are general opinion surveys. They tell you the mood amongst the general population. What matters more mostly is not so much the population on the whole, but the politically active part of the population. And for example, the people who read political books. If you walk into a bookstore nowadays, you'll see a lot of books of this caliber here. These are the bestsellers within that genre, and normally, well, they're all in different ways, they're all saying real socialism has never been tried, it deserves another chance now. Differences in emphasis, some literally say it just wasn't the right kind of socialism, some say, oh, this time is different because now we have the technology, some say this time is different because we've worked out how to make central planning work, differences in emphasis, but basically you could all summarize them by saying real socialism hasn't been tried, it deserves another chance now. And there's of course the whole media hype around it as well. We saw this last year when the commentator Ash Sarkar became a media phenomenon overnight, just for saying I'm literally a communist. That was her sole achievement in life, you could say, but since then she's rarely been off the TV screen, and in this case she had these rave reviews in fashion magazines. So this isn't this isn't just some fringe Marxist society somewhere. This is actually this is now the trendy thing to do. That raises the question: why is that? How can an idea that has failed so many times still be so popular? I'm going to go into that, but first of all, it makes sense to just clarify what we're actually talking about. What is socialism? Because there is some confusion around that term. The easiest thing to do would be to just go by the dictionary. The dictionary is quite clear. It says economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production. So if you use this definition, it's fairly straightforward what socialism is. If you apply this definition, then it becomes absolutely clear that the former Soviet Union, for example, was socialist, that the whole of the Eastern Bloc was socialist, and that today North Korea is socialist, and that China in the Maoist period was socialist, and so on. Dictionary is fairly straightforward on this. However, we don't always use words in the exact same way in which the dictionary defines them. So I am aware that not everybody uses the term socialism in that way. I've had some complaints from people who have read the book and said, well, I sort of consider myself a socialist, but I don't want a state-run economy, I don't mean that. In such a case, my answer is, well, in that case, that book is not about you. Then read something else. If you have your own idiosyncratic definition of socialism, fair enough. But I think it's justified in this case to go by the conventional definition, because that really is the form of socialism that has made a comeback. It's not, yes, some people conflate socialism with social democracy. I think spending more on the NHS is socialism, or being more like Sweden is socialism. But at least the more active ones, the more active members of this millennial socialist movement are very clear that that is not what they want. So here's, for example, someone from the Democratic Socialists of America who said social democracy left capital structurally dominant. Capitalists were able to hold democratic governments hostage. Social democracy is a step in the right direction, then, but ultimately not enough. And here's a journalist from the New Statesman and from the IPPR think tank who also says today the radical left in the UK and France is calling not for social democracy, but for democratic socialism. The former means taxation and regulation of private enterprise, the latter means democratic ownership of most large corporations. So clearly the difference here, there is clearly an emphasis here on collective ownership of the means of production, which is, again, the classic, the old school definition. This isn't about people who just confuse socialism with being a bit like Denmark. These are people who explicitly define socialism in opposition to that. And in fact, in this book, this happens all the time, where he starts with American capitalism, which the author considers absolutely terrible, and then talks about Sweden, so yeah, it's a bit better, but still not the real thing. It defines it very explicitly in opposition to that by saying it's no good to just try to reform capitalism because you will still have a capitalist class, and that is the problem that these people have. Because from a Marxist perspective, that makes sense. You believe that the people who own the means of production are the ones who truly run the country. That's the way you see it if you're a Marxist. So then, of course, you can't tolerate the private ownership of the means of production because you think this creates a class that will then always try to oppress the workers. So therefore, within these people's worldview is even consistent, that they insist very much on collectivizing the means of production. Okay, so that brings us back to the question. If these people are the leaders of this movement, if you want to call it that, are proper socialists, and if it is a big movement, if it is popular again, why after so many failures? A big part of the answer has to be that socialists have been very good at distancing themselves from real-world examples, and this is something that I'm guessing you all know from pub conversations, that whenever you argue with a socialist and they talk about it in abstract terms, in terms of abstract ideals, and as soon as you want to narrow it down a bit, make it more tangible, ask a more pedestrian question like, where has this ever worked? How does the socialist react? Well, they roll their eyes and say, oh, come on, you're being silly. You're probably, you're talking about the Soviet Union. Obviously, nobody wants that kind of socialism. And it has worked for them. Here are a couple of examples of that. There's Noam Chomsky, of course, who said, a long time ago, that there hasn't been a shred of socialism in the Soviet Union. Owen Jones, closer to home, so the socialist society doesn't exist yet. And Al-Bastani again, saying, while it is true that a number of political projects have labeled themselves communist, the aspiration was not accurate. So, all different ways of saying, no, it hasn't been tried. The real thing has never been around. Now, there's lots of problems with this claim, and the most glaring one is the fact that if you look at it historically, this distancing, this dismissal of socialist projects as not really socialist, this is a claim that has historically only ever been made after the event, retroactively, once a socialist project has already been discredited. Because that's what I do in the book. I go through these various examples and look at what Western intellectuals have said about various examples of socialist societies over the years. And the pattern is quite clear. It's that as long as the socialist project is in its prime, as long as it seems to work, you'd have a hard time finding anyone who says this isn't really socialism. You always get a few idealists who have extremely high standards, who would never fall for any real-world example. But the mainstream majority Western intellectual, as long as the socialist project is in its prime, they always say, this is real socialism, this is brilliant, this is the society that they want. It's just that as soon as it, well, either collapses or becomes thoroughly discredited and becomes an embarrassment to the socialist cause, that's when they fall silent on it. And then after a while, you get a new generation of socialists who don't remember this, the previous episode, and who just say, well, I don't want to talk about this old rubbish. Here's some new socialist project, and this is exciting, this is the real thing. Let's talk about that now. But this has been the pattern for over 100 years now. Started with the Soviet Union. That was, of course, the first big, large-scale socialist project, where nowadays it's considered lowbrow to even mention this in a discussion of socialism. You're supposed to judge socialism by the original intentions of the early Marxist thinkers, not by real-world outcomes. However, that wasn't always so. In the 30s, it was actually extremely in vogue to be pro-Soviet Union, pro-Stalin. There were, I'm sure this university, no example, would have had its Soviet societies, and plenty of Western intellectuals at the time were traveling to the Soviet Union, or going on guided tours, and coming back and being starry-eyed about it, saying they're building a new society there, and it's inspiring and it's wonderful. Couple of examples of that. The Webbs, probably the most famous example, co-founders of the LSE and of the New Statesman, they said in a book about the Soviet Union, we may perhaps sum up the constitution of the USSR by emphasizing its reliance on the widest possible participation of the whole adult population in the public business, which includes the planned control of the whole social environment. Power does actually emanate from the people. So this is a fairly typical quote from publications from that period. You get this idea that this is a society that is run democratically, not for profit, but for the people, by the people, and it's based on need and collectively determined preferences rather than individual egoism. And you can find variations of this theme right across the literature. Here's an American writer from that time who also says everyone acted as though the general good was his personal good. In America, the worker had no real voice in the management of the national economy. Here, meaning here in the Soviet Union, the average man felt himself master of everything. So again, this idea, the worker-run democracy, this is a thread that runs through the testimonies of people who visited the Soviet Union at the time. Here's an English writer from the same period, also said for the first time in history, the common man feels that the country belongs to him and not the privileged class that are his masters. The Marxian ideal of a classless society has been realized. And I could go on with this, but I don't want to bore you. You get the gist. This goes on and on. But essentially, that was the mainstream view in the 30s. This went on for a while, and then with the Cold War, the Soviet Union becoming the enemy, that became a bit of a liability, and it became increasingly hard to justify the actions of the Soviet Union, given that it was now quite clearly an aggressive regime. And then the former admirers of the Soviet Union just fell silent on it. It became forgotten. And then in the 60s, the same thing happened all over again, except that this time there were a bunch of new utopias. It was, in this case, Maoist China, but also Cuba and Vietnam, where, again, you had Western intellectuals traveling to those places, coming back full of praise. The only difference this time was that now they were defining it also in opposition to Soviet socialism, so, defining it as an alternative to both Western capitalism, which is obviously bad, and Soviet socialism, which is obviously a fraud. This is the real thing. So here are these bad examples. We want none of that. We want this. This is a proper workers' democracy. There is, for example, this journalist, later an MEP, who said, "A people is marching with fervor towards the future. This people may be the incarnation of the new civilization of the world." And again, this is a fairly typical statement. You also get, again, the idea that this is a grassroots democracy. Here's a British historian at the time who said the regime is authoritarian only towards a minority who are not workers or peasants. China's successes are being achieved by the voluntary and even enthusiastic effort of most of the people. So again, if you got rid of the time and place specific references here, this sounds just like these earlier pilgrimages to the Soviet Union. You get once again the sentiment that yes, from a Western perspective, this may look like a dictatorship, but no, if you understand what's really happening there, you will know that this is actually a peasants' democracy. The workers are running the show. They're getting together and they're discussing what they want to produce, and this is how this economy works. And here's the then or future, can't remember, the Dean of Canterbury, who said, "All men regard Mao as a symbol of their deliverance. The peasant looks at the land he tills, Mao's gift. The factory worker thinks of a wage of 100 pounds of rice instead of 10, Mao's gift," and so on. I've got too many of those, don't want to bore you with it, but the short summary is that, again, you had this going on for a while, and then after Mao's death, the mainstream intellectuals were no longer interested, moved on to other causes, and then you only had the crackpots left. And that's why today we associate Maoism with sectarian fringe groups. We think of movies like this one, and there was this other series from the 70s where we can't remember. But basically the idea being that these are people splitting over minuscule differences, on Marxist theory, things that are not of interest to anyone else. And that's what happened after the mainstream intellectuals have moved on to other causes. That's what Maoism became. But up until that point, mid-70s or so, Maoism was a mainstream pursuit. That was the mainstream idea among lots of well-established Western intellectuals, not talking about some fringe figures from minor parties, but people in respected positions, mainstream academics and so on. It's just that once that had fallen out of fashion and they had moved on, it became once again not real socialism in retrospect, but that was not the perception at the time. And then later in the 60s and 70s, there were a couple of less well-known examples where you didn't have mass pilgrimages, but where you still had a fair share of Western commentators and intellectuals admiring various models. North Korea was one of them. It's now considered extremely bad form to mention North Korea. Of course, now that's seen as the ultimate straw man to mention North Korea in a discussion on socialism. But wasn't always so. North Korea also had its fair share of supporters. Here's Joan Robinson from the Cambridge School of Economics, one of the most famous British economists of the time in the 60s, saying all the economic miracles of the post-war world are put into shape by these achievements, meaning the economic achievements of North Korea. The outward signs of a cult are very marked, but Prime Minister Kim Il-sung seems to function as a messiah rather than a dictator. And this is a paper which ends with a prediction where she says at some point South Korea will have to fortify its border because otherwise all the South Koreans will escape to North Korea. And it didn't age well, but that's usually the case for these socialist publications. And here's somebody, an activist from the Black Panther Party in America, which was the socialist wing of the civil rights movement. He said, here in Korea we have found a people who have laid the foundations of communism and who are now rushing to transform their society into an earthly paradise. We will tell the American people of the glorious victories of socialist revolution. And again, this goes on and on, but you get the gist. But this was, again, a mainstream perception for a while, even if on a smaller scale. And on a very small scale, you even had this happening in the case of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge had their Western supporters. Here, for example, is someone from, can't remember where, but a British political scientist who said the awesome task was to transform accumulated bitterness and suffering into impetus for socio-economic reconstruction of the country. Most Cambodians leaving the country in 1975 managed to do so without difficulty. They were among the few whose values could not be accommodated in a people's state. So again, this expression here, people's state, you have once again the idea this is an economy run democratically, jointly, for the benefit of all. And it's just the capitalists, the selfish ones who can't adjust to that kind of society, who want to leave. And this went on for the whole time. I'm not going to go through all of them, but genocide denial going on, and in this case it was a shorter period, but it still happened. And then you had in the 80s, you had various places in Africa, Tanzania, Mozambique, who were idolized also on a smaller scale, in this case not mass pilgrimages, but there was always some place. That's what I'm trying to get at. That's the short summary. There's always some new utopia, and the general tenor was always, never mind these old failed examples, nobody's talking about that, but look what's going on here. There's something new and something exciting happening, they'll get it right, this is real socialism. And then in the 90s, that was an unusual period. For the first time since the Russian Revolution, there was just no example that many socialists would rally around. There was still Cuba and North Korea. You would still, of course, get the Che Guevara shirt chic, but few people would seriously have argued, we want to be like Cuba. And this only changed then in the mid-2000s when Venezuela became the next big thing. Because Chavez was initially elected in 98 already, but initially he wasn't well known in the West, for the same reason that I'm guessing you wouldn't know the name of his predecessor. Normally we don't know the names of Venezuelan politicians. But then this was the time of the anti-globalization movement, and he sort of grew into that. He attended a conference, the World Social Forum, which was the gathering of all the anti-globalization groups, and he started to coin a phrase. He started to describe his policies as the socialism of the 21st century, and that just went viral and exploded, and soon after that, that phrase was widely used. I certainly remember this. I was an undergraduate at the time, and you could see Venezuela flags popping up everywhere. But before then, didn't even know what their flag looked like, but suddenly it was, you couldn't get away from it. And you had statements here like this from Owen Jones. This is from, I think, 6 or 7 years ago, where he said, Venezuela is an inspiration to the world. It really does show that there is an alternative. And elsewhere, under Chavez, the poor have become a political power that cannot be ignored. He has proved that it is possible to break with neoliberal dogma. This is a fairly typical statement in the sense that he describes Venezuelan socialism as not just a success story in its own right, but rather as something that other countries should learn from, as a model for the West. That's why he draws this conclusion. And elsewhere he says it more explicitly, where he says, it's important to me that we don't just see this as something that's happening elsewhere. This is something that should give us all hope. So clearly the idea being, this isn't just something that's brilliant for the people of Venezuela, this is something that we should actively copy here. Break with neoliberal dogma. He proved that that is possible. And Seamus Mill, who's now Corbyn's main advisor, made the same point. He said, around the same time, he said Venezuela and its Latin American allies have demonstrated that it's no longer necessary to accept a failed economic model, as many social democrats in Europe still do. So again, the sentiment here is clearly, this isn't just great on its own terms, this is something that we should learn from. We should draw the right lessons, which is ditch the kind of social democracy that makes its peace with the market, by which he means the Labour Party as it was then, and the continental European social democratic parties which basically try to redistribute, but who have made their peace with the market economy, who would no longer try to nationalize the means of production, who would have ditched their old Marxist legacy. That's what he's taking aim against here clearly, saying we no longer have to accept this. This was something that we did maybe in the 90s, the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but forget it, socialism is possible. And here's Corbyn himself, who said just after Chavez's death, at a rally in London, in honor of Chavez, where he said, Chavez showed us that there is a different and a better way of doing things. It's called socialism. And so if somebody says today Venezuela was never socialist, well, the great man himself literally did call it that. So, and if he isn't the judge of that, I don't know who is. Here, this is also Corbyn 2 years later, when Venezuela was already in full-blown crisis. The economy was already in free fall, but there he was a bit behind the curve, as is usually the case, where he said, Venezuela is seriously conquering poverty by emphatically rejecting neoliberal policies. As with Cuba, the threat to the USA by Venezuela is a threat by example of what social justice can achieve. Even in 2015, when their crisis was already fully underway, he still seriously thought that workers in the West, in America, probably elsewhere, would look at Venezuela and think, wow, we want to live like that too. And you then had, you can now see the contrasts. I mean, at that time, Corbyn was a bit behind. At that time, most socialists have fallen silent on it, and then a couple of years later, around 2017 was roughly the turning point. You had people actively denying that Venezuela was ever socialist. Chomsky was one of the early visitors in 2007. He said, what's so exciting about Venezuela is that I can see how a better world is being created. The transformations that Venezuela is making towards the creation of another socio-economic model could have a global impact. So this is again this motive, a new economic model, something that has implications for everyone. And just 10 years later, he said, I never described Chavez's state capitalist government as socialist, or even hinted at such an absurdity. It was quite remote from socialism. So here we can see this process that I'm describing in the book in real time. Normally this happens over the course of 2 generations. You get one generation being enthusiastic, saying yes to this socialism, and then the next one who simply don't remember this and say no, that was never socialism. Here it's actually the same people. Here it's a highly compressed version of something that in earlier decades took more time. Now you can almost spot it with the naked eye. Here's a more extreme example. Here's John McDonnell in the space of 4 years. In 2014, crisis had just begun, but it was still somewhat deniable. He said, Chavez lit a spark that really started a firebrand. Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution became an item on the agenda for all socialists. Here you have the contrast between capitalism in crisis and socialism in action. And then just 4 years later, he said, I don't think Venezuela is a socialist country. I don't think they have been following socialist policies. And as a result of that, they experience some problems. The problem is they're not socialist enough. And this is a slightly unusual, this is a compressed version of the pattern that I'm describing. But that aside, it's always been the same. You always have these 3 stages of every time there's a socialist revolution. Within a couple of days, the first Western intellectuals arrive and idolize it, and this is the honeymoon period. This is the time when the system either has a relatively good reputation in the West. That was the case with the Soviet Union, because they had their industrial progress, and that was a real initial achievement that was happening. It wasn't great for the population, because it was mostly militarization, but nonetheless, I can imagine that from the outside it would have looked impressive that they had this former peasant economy. Now suddenly they have big factories springing up everywhere. So there were these initial achievements, and the political standing was relatively high. During that period, you always get Western intellectuals saying this is real socialism and it's great. It's either that they have some initial achievements, or that even where they don't have them, the rest of the population just doesn't know much about them. So initially, when Venezuela came up for the first time, I didn't know anything about it, so couldn't really comment on it. Couldn't really argue with socialists about that. They had that knowledge from socialist sources. They came and said it's working there, and I could only say, well, okay, fair enough, let's wait. But I couldn't actively argue about it. Normally, you just wouldn't know much about that, and as long as that knowledge of what's happening in those places isn't widespread, the socialists are the only ones who are talking about it, and it's not a huge damage for their cause. It's actually good for them if they can say, yes, there is this place, they are implementing our ideas and it's working. It's just that then when it becomes a bit embarrassing, when you have, for example, large numbers of refugees showing up from that place. That was the issue with Cuba, for example, that in the 60s and 70s, and well, pretty much the whole time, you had large numbers of refugees arriving, and then you have a bit of a problem if you're describing this as a people state, but the people are trying to get away from it. Then that's a bit of a PR problem. That's when this rowing back starts. Then you get a period which is somewhere in between. They wouldn't yet say, no, it was never socialist, but they'd say, well, okay, they're being undermined from the outside, often just copying and pasting regime propaganda about saboteurs. This is, for example, in the Soviet case, this is when you had various senior figures, politicians, journalists, literally say it was all real. The accusations were all true, otherwise it wouldn't happen. Why would the Soviets execute somebody who hasn't done anything bad? It must be that they really are all baddies. And at some point, though, this just becomes untenable. It's just almost universally known that the place in question is an absolute hellhole, and becomes an embarrassment for socialists to say, we want to be like that. So, and that's when we move towards the not real socialism period, when socialists would just not accept it at all that it was ever socialist, and would say, no, that had nothing to do with socialism. You need to look at the original intentions, you need to look at what Marx said, and this has nothing to do with it, and you just don't understand socialism. And that's where it always ends with all these examples. This is the graveyard, this is of socialist experiments, it's the utopias of yesteryear. It always ends with the it wasn't really socialism stage, or with the it's a straw man to mention it stage. Now, raises the question, why does this happen again and again, and why does socialism end up, why is it misunderstood so often? How hard can it be to just understand it properly and make it work? Well, this is something that I'm guessing here I don't have to spend much time on. This is the the Hayek Society, so you would know about why socialism fails economically. There is, of course, the what Hayek called dispersed knowledge, the argument that economically relevant knowledge about conditions of supply and demand, what's available where and what quantities and who wants it. This kind of knowledge is dispersed. Nobody knows all of it. We need a mechanism that can absorb all that dispersed knowledge from various people, and that's of course the system of market prices. Market prices are the mechanism to tap into all that dispersed knowledge that often cannot be expressed well, often be tacit. It cannot be known to a planning bureaucracy, even if that planning bureaucracy is democratically run. It's got nothing to do with that. It could be people's planning bureaucracy, or it could be the population as a whole having referendums on it all the time, or some other form of public consultation. Got nothing to do with that. You need a mechanism that can tap into the knowledge that of millions of people and communicate that knowledge in an easy way, and that's what market prices do. And then, of course, the market process, the competitive process of the market, is a trial and error process, which is what you need to do in a world of limited knowledge. We don't know what works, we don't know how to organize a successful industry, or let alone an entire successful economy, and therefore we need to try lots of different things and see what works, emulate the examples that work, and discard the ones that don't. That's what the market does all the time and automatically, and planned economies haven't found a way of replicating that. And thirdly, there is the strength of market economies is that if you're not happy with something in a market economy, you don't need to persuade 50% of the population first to vote against whatever it is that you're not happy with. You can just choose something else. You can work for a different employer, you can go to a different supermarket, go to a different restaurant, you can change your energy supplier. You don't have to persuade the majority of the population first. You can just do your own thing. And this is something that socialist economies haven't been able to replace. They've tried to say that, well, okay, we don't have this exit option here, but you can improve things from within. You can argue with other people. It's just that firstly, most of the time, when something doesn't work properly, we don't know the exact reason, and don't want to know necessarily. And we don't want to sit in meetings and talk about what to do differently. When we're not happy with something, we want to be able to walk away from it, and that's much more empowering and liberating as well as, and of course, more economically efficient than trying to do everything communally. And then, why is socialism always authoritarian? Well, again, not a coincidence. It's not like in Animal Farm, where it's just that the other animals aren't keeping an eye on the pigs, and therefore the pigs take over. No, it's just that there is generally a conflict between central planning and local autonomy. Once you have a central plan in place, you need a state that is able to enforce that plan. You can't say, okay, we have this plan, but actually you can all do what you like. If you want to deviate from the plan, that's perfectly fine. Because, well, you no longer have market prices that coordinate economic activity. You no longer have self-adjusting mechanisms, so what do? You need to replace it with something, and the only alternative is crude force. And that would still be true even if it was all perfectly democratic. You would then have that crude force being exercised by 50% plus one of the population, but it would still be totalitarian, even if you had a majority backing it. You need to be able to direct the factors of production to where you want them to be, and that those factors of production include labor, of course. So that's why it's perfectly consistent within socialist economy that they had these systems of internal passports, for example. I think Cuba still has. Soviet Union definitely had them, where you needed a local residence permit and couldn't easily move from one town to the next. And of course, the extension of that being the ban on immigration, where the Berlin Wall is then a perfectly logical extrapolation of that. It was built not out of some sadistic impulse by the people in power. It was just that the planning authorities told them, look, how are we supposed to plan anything when the workforce runs around and goes over to West Berlin? Our 5-year plan is already worthless because we no longer have the workforce numbers that we were basing our plans on. So how are we supposed to plan anything in this way? And that's when they have to say, right, okay, that's the only way to do it. And when you collectivize everything, it is also within the socialist economy no longer possible to say, okay, you may not approve of the choices I make, you may not approve of the way I live my life, but it's my business, it's none of your business, leave me alone. That's not possible in a socialist economy because everything is everyone's business. That's generally the case in communities, and that's perfectly fine as long as you enter communities voluntarily and as long as you have an exit option. But when the whole country becomes, and the whole economy becomes a communal effort, then that becomes stifling automatically. And it's not that the idea is misunderstood, that would still be true if it were perfectly democratic. But that in itself is a myth, democratic socialism. It isn't really, it doesn't, economic planning doesn't lend itself to democracy easily, for the same reason that you wouldn't have democratic decision on warfare. You could in principle have had a referendum on the Iraq war, say. You could have decided democratically in that sense. But if it had gone ahead, if you had like the Brexit referendum, let's say 52% saying yes, let's go to war with Iraq, you wouldn't then have had a democratic plan on how exactly the armies should move and how exactly that should be executed on the ground. That's something that only experts can realistically do. And the same is true in an economy. You have most economic decisions are, business decisions, management decisions are just automatic, are just by nature technical and dry, and they're therefore not easily amenable to public participation. In fact, we've seen this on a much smaller scale now with the Brexit referendum, where on the one hand, yes, you can get high levels of engagement. We have a turnout of more than 70%, much more than in a general election. You can get large numbers of people interested in a political decision, but you can realistically only do that if you talk about the issue in terms of broad values. If you make it about national sovereignty versus international engagement. That's the sort of thing that yes, large numbers of people are interested in, but then we saw quickly after the referendum, as soon as it moved on to the distinction between the customs union and a customs union, that's where you've already lost more than half of the population, and quite understandably, most people don't want to get involved within that level of detail. The issue here isn't apathy, it's just that most of these issues are just by their very nature specialist, and you don't want to get involved in all of that. There are, for example, there are now these plans by Momentum and groups like that where they say we're going to nationalize half of the economy, but it will not be like the 70s. We will run them democratically. Well, what does that mean? I mean, who can you imagine showing up to a board meeting of an energy company? I mean, how boring is that? Even somebody, I've written a bit on the energy market. I'd say I'm more interested in it than probably 90% of the population, but I wouldn't dream of showing up at a board meeting of a publicly owned people's energy company because I'm not interested in it at that level of detail. I don't want to know about their day-to-day decisions of running the business, so the idea that you could run this with mass public participation is just absurd. We've seen this even where we've had extensions of democracy in the system we have now. We've had, a couple of years ago, the coalition government, Conservative Liberal coalition, introduced democratically elected police and crime commissioners. Not a bad idea. I'm not opposed to that, but realistically, turnout is quite low, and most people, I think, just vote along party lines. At least the results more or less mirror the standing of the parties at the time. So nothing wrong with it necessarily, but I wouldn't oversell it. You couldn't say that this is a mass democratic engagement and the police is now run democratically by the people. That would be nonsense. It can be done, but there are limits to democratic engagement, and that this is true even today. There are lots of things that are already state-run. Of course, we don't have a pure market economy. Nothing, not even close. We have lots of things that are state-owned, state-run. The Royal Bank of Scotland has a majority government stake, but if you stopped random people in the street and asked them, you know, the Royal Bank of Scotland is really your bank, because it's the people's bank and you're a member of the people. So how do you feel about that? I don't think anyone would say, yeah, it's great, the Royal Bank of Scotland is my bank. And socialists never identify a mechanism how democratically running big organizations, let alone the entire economy, how that's supposed to work. It's all at an abstract level. And that's also the reason why socialism, despite its multiple failures, just doesn't go away. First of all, it does make intuitive sense. Socialism is easy to understand because, and that's the point also that Hayek made decades ago, where he said, we practice socialism in small groups. You would not apply market transactions within a household. You would not charge your partner for doing the washing up. You wouldn't say, I'll do the washing up today, but that will be £3.50, please. In small groups, planning things collectively makes perfect sense, and a mistake that socialists make is they extrapolate from that and think what works in a small group can be done in a huge society of millions of people. There is this book, I can't remember the author's name, it was called Why Not Socialism, where he says, he starts by describing a camping trip where people just share their equipment and everything is nice and harmonious, and then he says, look, socialism works, and that's pretty much the argument. Okay, yeah, and on a camping trip, I'm a socialist too. I just wouldn't apply that to a country of 65 million inhabitants. The Israeli kibbutz is probably the most large-scale example, but even they seem to have an upper limit at around 1,000 people, which would be the size of a very small village, and even there, once it goes beyond a certain size, they become more like conventional enterprises. So if they can't make it work, they have a century of experience. People who run these kibbutzim, they've been doing this for ages. They have all this expertise. They haven't managed to scale it up. If they can't do it, I have my doubts that Aaron Bastani and Owen Jones are going to make it work. But that's one of the leaps of faith that socialists make, and it's the reason why it makes intuitive sense. And yeah, you just jump from a level where it is appropriate to a level where it no longer is, and socialists don't usually think about that. The image of socialism has also changed massively. I think a couple of years ago that would have been a big difference. If somebody had asked you, what's your idea of a typical socialist, you would have described the socialist worker salesman, and I often see a socialist worker salesman at a train station, and who just stands there and waves the socialist worker and shouts, and everyone avoids him, and you can tell from a mile away that he's a complete crank. And for quite a while, people like him were the public face of socialism. Now, I think it's much more likely that you would think of someone from Novara Media or one of those outlets. It's the hipsterization of socialism, basically. It's become trendy and cool to be a socialist. And that's something that's hard to argue against. You can't argue against that by coming up and quoting Hayek and talking about dispersed knowledge. That's not the way you persuade someone who is using this as an image for signaling purposes. But then, the main logical fallacy is probably that socialists define the idea of real socialism when they say that wasn't real socialism, and that wasn't real socialism either. They define real socialism by the outcomes they want to see, meaning a democratically run economy, and then when an actual socialist experiment doesn't achieve that, then they say, oh look, it wasn't democratically run, therefore it cannot have been real socialism. But that's a logical fallacy, of course. You wouldn't do this with any other political or economic philosophy. You can't judge, you can't define a system in terms of outcomes you want to see, and but then, and you can't judge it exclusively by its original intentions. You can't it's easy to say, oh, go back and read Marx, but you wouldn't do this. If somebody wanted to judge capitalism, you wouldn't tell them, oh, just read Adam Smith, forget everything that happened in the last 250 years, just read The Wealth of Nations, that's all you need to know. No, of course you would want to know whether how it's actually worked out. It's only in the case of socialism that we're supposed to do it that way, judged exclusively by the original intentions. But unfortunately, it seems to be working for them. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Kristian. We had an advertised sort of end time of 7:30, so if people need to rush off, we're not socialists, you are allowed to leave. But if people would like to stay, perhaps we could take a few questions.
Yeah.
So, open to the floor. Should we go front row next? John.
Hello. If I could have two brief ones. Mr. Corbyn has always been quite open about what he believes is quite sincere. Do you think we could be looking at a communist situation in Britain within 9 months or so?
Absolutely not impossible. At the moment, he's doing badly at the polls, but that was true last time as well. And the polls are quite freakish. I have no idea how a Labour government would work out in practice. There are, of course, the Corbynites. At the moment they seem dominant, but then there is the Parliamentary Labour Party, where most of them don't share those socialist beliefs. How it would work out in practice, who would win the upper hand, I've absolutely no idea.
The second question is a bit of a fringe interest, but if you took Latin America, say the Andes, do you see a conflict between inter-village cooperation and freedom? Do you think that is possible under capitalism? Inter-village cooperation is a tradition in the Andes.
I don't know how that works.
No.
Do you just mean trade between villages?
It's kind of there's a tradition of like one hand washes the other between villages.
Oh. No, that would just be a form of market exchange. It would then be in kind. It would be like the round buying system at the pub. That is, you could call it a quasi-market form of exchange. You could call it just reciprocity. I don't know how you want to label it, but those are absolutely things that are possible in a free society, and those kind of norms normally emerge.
That's very helpful, Kristian. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, thank you. It was really enlightening. Coming from Slovakia, it's a post-communist country, so and we are actually a country that actually really experienced over just 8 years how you can get through post-socialist, post-communistic, post-socialistic, post-authoritarian country into one of the fastest growing countries in Europe and practically in the world under the conservative Christian democratic governance. And therefore, but still the people in our country, I would say majority of them, still feel that socialism is a good idea. And we talked about socialism, in a sense, what's wrong with it inherently. And it seems that the fact, that the history, that the data are on our side. Then I'm asking you, what are we doing wrong? Perhaps every single one of us here, if socialist is not laughed at, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is being prominent person instead of like, well, this fringe communist guy we got in Slovakia just laughing on him like, oh come on, like this is ridiculous. What are we doing wrong? What can we do rather to put it constructively?
Well, I'm trying, somehow not very successfully. Yeah, I think as silly as it may seem to us, as obvious as it may seem to us, if somebody says it wasn't real socialism, comes up with excuses, there's a temptation to just dismiss that. It does make sense to engage with it on its own terms and tell the socialists, look, I get that. I understand that you're not trying to rebuild gulags. I understand that you're not trying to rebuild the Berlin Wall. I get where you're coming from. I'm just saying, even in the best of circumstances, it would fail, and for specific reasons. But that's just hard to explain. The reason why I've got this epilogue here in the book, which is about a hypothetical socialist society, which is run by the nicest people you could possibly imagine, and it still becomes totalitarian. The reason why I wrote that is that I had the conversation a couple of times, and realize it's quite hard to explain if you have to summarize it in a few words. Somebody would say, well, what's the issue? You could just have the workers self-managing their affairs. You don't need a big bureaucracy. Just devolve power, get rid of the Stalinist bureaucracy, give power to the workers. Sounds beautiful, and now you have 3 sentences explaining why that's wrong. It's quite hard to do, but I think that's what we have to try to do.
Thank you very much.
If we go for the lady in front row.
Actually, now I wanted to comment on your question, but I think it might have something to do, the problem in getting the message across might have something to do that we keep focusing on why it fails, and not so much addressing that it really isn't that ideal. And usually it's, oh, the problem is that it's a utopia. I'm not sure that it is a utopia. It's not anything that I would idealize as a world that I would like to live in. So maybe that should shape our conversation. I don't know. I don't really have a question, but I do perhaps have another socialist argument to add to your arsenal, or counter-argument, which is something that I've heard quite often here. Liberalism too has failed, and we still support it. So I suppose we say this because of rising inequality, or because of systemic injustice. And so liberalism too has not lived up to its proposed ideals. And so I wonder, how would you take that one?
I'd start by acknowledging it. You have political ideals never quite live up to their promises, and it's just that some age better than others. And the comparison would be, in the case of socialism, we've got so many examples where you have fairly clear counterfactuals. If you compare Maoism to Taiwan at the same time, or of course the obvious ones, East and West Germany, North and South Korea, then yeah, they have higher inequality in South Korea, but where would you rather live? And it's we don't have to become utopians to just say it's worked okay so far. We've got some fairly good examples, and all of these could be even better, but that would be more of an incremental argument. They're not saying you're not falling into the same trap and saying it wasn't real liberalism. Real liberalism has never been tried, but you can say Switzerland comes fairly close to liberal society. Hong Kong, okay, not right now in political terms, but the whole time, and economically at least, comes fairly close. Singapore, not too bad. And here are a couple of things that these places could do even better, where rather than saying this is not the real thing, it's got nothing to do with me, you accept a lot of it, and you're just saying in this area and in that area there could be even further improvements. That's not a utopian argument. There you're not asking the other person to imagine a completely different type of society, but it's more where you're maybe putting things together piecemeal. You might say that there may be no single society that is the liberal's dream, Hayekian dream, but for each subsector, whether it's healthcare, education, pensions, there are normally a couple of places you can identify that would be pretty good. And there, it's not such a stretch to say, how about if you combine the health system of this place with the pension system of that place, and so on, until you have put these mosaics together, these pieces of the puzzle, and then it has, in a sense, been tried, just in a piecemeal way, not in one single place, but the different parts of it have been tried all over the world.
Gentleman at the back has had his hand up for a while.
Yes. Well, facts don't often get in the way of socialists, and one of the things that happened not so long ago, Stalin got his highest ever popularity rating in Russia. 50% of people said he was more good than bad, and one of the arguments I've heard given by some of my trendy friends is that, well, only a few 100,000 people went to the gulags and they had dentists, and it was quite nice. So how do you deal with that argument?
And that's easier to deal with. I mean, that would be these would be the people who wouldn't appear in that book, because they would at least be consistent. They would still defend Stalin today. They wouldn't say it wasn't real socialism. If you're proper tanky, so if Stalin did nothing wrong, okay, fair enough. I'm not that worried about those people, because that is clearly a subculture, and I don't think that will become a big thing. It might become a bit bigger, and maybe it already has in recent years, but that's mostly because once you have people like Bastani and Sarkar talking about communism on the media all the time, that becomes normal. And if you want to be, if you want to show how edgy you are, then where do you have to go? There's only tankyism left. You can only become a literal Stalinist, and then say, oh, these people think they're communists. Haha, look at our communists. I think
Thank you.
If he goes for the gentleman in the floral shirt, and it may be due to his time, so gentleman floral shirt and Jack. Yeah.
I have two questions. One, why do you think intellectuals have always been so averse to capitalism? And secondly, what do you think of Dr. Richard Wolff?
And Jack, sorry.
Why do you think the media are so keen to tout these socialist figures so much, like Sarkar has out?
Okay, why are intellectuals averse to capitalism? Well, intellectuals are not more likely than anyone else to be right. They're just better at coming up with rationalizations for what they believe. And in a sense, there is even a bit of a rhetorical challenge. I mean, sometimes people adopt counterintuitive positions as a way of signaling cleverness. When you hear somebody, for example, arguing, you know what? The Vikings weren't actually barbarians. They were quite sophisticated. Maybe some truth in that, but why would somebody say that? I think it is a bit of, I'm taking a counter-intuitive position to signal I'm clever, because saying the Vikings were barbarians, that's not a very sophisticated one. And in the same way, it's just kind of too obvious to say South Korea is a better place than North Korea, West Germany was a better place than East Germany. It might be a bit of a self-imposed challenge for someone to say, okay, I'm going to make the case that seems impossible to make, but I'm going to do it. It is in one sense very intuitive socialism, but there is also this appeal of clever contrarianism in it, and that might appeal to intellectuals especially. And yeah, I mean, there is also this whole theory which is all a bit speculative. I'm not so sure about that, but plenty of people, starting with Ludwig von Mises, said that intellectuals resent capitalism because in a capitalist society there's only limited demand for intellectuals, and if you see yourself as intellectually superior to most of the population, and then you see that that isn't actually widely rewarded. There might be the entrepreneur who hasn't read nearly as many books as you have and isn't as articulate as you are, but makes a lot more money. Then there might be this status resentment, and that might make someone averse to capitalism. It is it's often, at least in later stages, it often overlapped with anti-consumerism socialism. So there might be a bit of a clue there that the intellectuals would see that as, at least want to see that as a socialist society, as a society which is less materialistic and more in tune with their own values. What was the second question? Oh, Richard Wolff. Yeah, he's one of those classic real socialism has never been tried. But I haven't read any of his books, just seen a couple of videos. But it is, again, the whole thing. He escapes into abstract rhetoric, but he doesn't identify any mechanism. How would his workers, his worker democracy work? How would we all decide what to produce? It's all this escaping into abstraction, always very easy to do. What was the question?
Why are the media so keen to keep socialism trending high status when they tout people like Sarkar?
I think that's, I'm afraid that's probably mostly demand driven. I mean, there may be a lot of people sympathizing with that, but I doubt they would do it if there was no demand for it. I think that is a way of maybe they even want a bit, a slice of that coolness and trendiness. I'm pretty sure that's the reason why Sarkar was on this historical documentary about the downfall of the Weimar Republic. I mean, what's that got to do with Navarra media and luxury communism? I think that really was because it could otherwise have been a fairly dry topic, and suddenly you have this trendy figure that's maybe a way of telling the kids, look, this is cool, watch our documentary. History documentary is normally not something that appeals to trendy millennials very much, and that could be the way to make it cool.
Last two questions, I think. So 1 and 2.
Sure. Thank you very much. You started your talk by showing us the alarmingly high levels of support for socialism among millennials, and I was wondering whether that is, especially in the Western context, a specific Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, or we also see that on the continent. And if it's more Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, because if you look at the European elections this May, left-wing parties had the worst showing on the continent ever. Then I'd be wondering if perhaps a moderate expansion of the welfare state in the United States or in the UK to German, Danish or Swedish levels would help quenching that support and basically saving the market economy from ideologues like Corbyn or like AOC.
Yeah, I'd say the swing has certainly been more extreme here. I don't know if it is more prevalent in Anglo-Saxon countries. Now, and the survey swing has been bigger, that when I got interested in politics first in the late 90s, it was the Democratic Party in the States and the Labour Party here. They were seen as not real social democratic parties, sort of if a pro-market social democratic modernizer on the continent wanted to signal their pro-market credentials, they would say something positive about Tony Blair, for example. That would be the way of showing I'm not like these old hardline socialists, I'm a pro-market, modern kind of guy. That was the perception at the time, and in that sense the swing has been much more extreme. And the German SPD would not have gone, would not have been as relaxed about markets as Tony Blair was. But I couldn't imagine them electing a Corbyn figure like that. So that's they've been more consistent. They were clearly to the left of the British Labour Party in the 90s and 2000s, and the British left has just gone way past suddenly and moved very fast. Could you change it by expanding welfare? Well, that's in the States. It could well be that a universal healthcare program, some beefed up version of Obamacare maybe, would sap demand for socialism a bit. But Britain really isn't that different from the Northern European social democracies. It's mostly a difference in rhetoric that a British conservative would, at least maybe not so much now, but at least until a couple of years ago, would have been more confident talking about the market economy, would even use the word capitalism, whereas a German Christian Democrat just wouldn't do that. They wouldn't talk about capitalism. They might say the social market economy, but they would be quite timid as outing themselves as capitalists. And so that's, I think, a reason why we perceive Britain to be more liberal than continental economies, but I don't think it really is. In lots of areas, at least, it's quite identifiably not the case. The British healthcare system is far more state-dominated than most of its continental counterparts. The housing market, and here I don't need to tell you about this, you live in Oxford, the most extreme example here. In lots of important ways, Britain is more statist than the alleged social democracies.
And very last question.
My question is, in your in your opinion, are there difference between socialism in West, I mean, primarily Christian values country, the countries with the Christian values, and non-Christians, like Asia, is Confucian, and is this like communism a political system? If you look at it, it doesn't say specifically about the social justice and the welfare and redistribution of wealth. It's more like ownership and fair share at a fair payment for the labor. What happens between two parties? One is a service provider and receiver. What happens to the rest is not really relevant. And in case of China, they don't have social, their social net is very limited. And additional question is, how is socialism popular in Asian countries?
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yes, it's true. Socialist systems generally, but that was true in more Westernized societies as well. They're not as strongly redistributive as Western socialists probably think. For example, well, I certainly know in the case of the GDR of East Germany that there was a duty to work. Something that nowadays we would call workfare. When they introduced something here in Britain, you had Guardian columnists denouncing it as slave labor. The idea that you should have to work for the dole. That was standard practice in socialist countries in Central and Eastern Europe. That they didn't see themselves as welfare states. It was they would say, no, we've eliminated exploitation, we've eliminated alienation. Under capitalism, it's perfectly legitimate if you don't want to work, because you'd be alienated from the system, and quite rationally you don't want to work for an exploiter. But here you don't have that excuse, so you show up for work. That's why they're much more punitive also in that sense.
But in this case, in this case, if you're saying that, doesn't mean like the new generation of people just misunderstood the socialism in a way that they mixing the social welfare equivalent of socialism, when in reality it is never been.
Oh, yeah, they'll hate it when they get it, but it doesn't change the fact that for now they seem to want it.
So it doesn't mean like that it's our failure to put the message across.
Only so much you can do.
You do your best. You do your best.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming. I hope you've enjoyed Kristian's speech today.